Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another episode of F.A.M.E Weekly Talk. Your girl, Miss Maxia here. And of course, you guys know how this works, all right? Fame, food, art, music, the environment. Coming to you guys live from beautiful Barbados. Yay. Okay. This week's theme, What's Your Beef? And of course, we're joined by activist, lawyer, and vegan. Yeah. Lalu Hanuman. He's going to be talking to us about the harmful effects of beef, well, meat eating really, on the environment. Welcome to F.A.M.E.
Hello, Mishka.
How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you in the flesh.
Nice to see you too. Flesh, no pun intended.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. Okay. Anyway, so thank you so much for deciding to, do this, be a part of F.A.M.E, Weekly Talk. So this week's theme, What's Your Beef? And you're going to be talking to us about the harmful effects of beef consumption or meat eating,
Yeah.
on the environment. So first of all, introduce yourself. Let them know exactly who Mr. Hanuman is.
Okay, as you say, Mishka, my name is Lalu Hanuman. I've been in Barbados now for 13 years. I'm a lawyer by profession, and I'm also a trustee and the secretary of the Caribbean Vegetarian Vegan Community, which is a charity that was established last year in Barbados to promote a plant-based diet. I've been on a plant-based diet now for 50 years.
As in 50?
As in 50, but the first 20 years of which was I was a vegetarian, and the following 30 years I was a vegan.
Wow.
Or am a vegan. When we spoke the last time, there was so much interference we couldn't communicate properly,
Yeah.
but that is what the reality is. And what we're trying to do is promote a plant-based diet in the Caribbean area in terms of people's health, but also it has environmental and obviously animal rights connotations as well.
Wow. So is your focus more the impact that it's having on the environment itself, or so much getting people away from eating beef?
Well, in terms of my own personal motivation, as I said, I've been on a plant-based diet now for 50 years. But I went on a plant-based diet when I was about 13, so you know my age.
Wow.
Right? Right? Assuming you can do a little bit of maths.
I mean.
Right? But the reason being is because in Guyana, where I grew up, the divide between the rural and urban is very blurred. So people in the city areas would have farm animals, what would be considered to be farm animals. And I would sometimes find an orphaned animal because the mother died in childbirth, or in Guyana we have alligators and snakes and various other predators, and they might have been eaten during childbirth, killed during childbirth. So I would have like a baby lamb or something, or a baby chicken, and I would keep it as a friend. And obviously when it grew up, I wouldn't want to eat it.
No.
So that is how my personal plant-based diet process began. And my motivation was then and is now still animal rights, because at the end of the day, an animal is just like you and I. It has a brain and a nervous system. It feels pain. And any incarceration we subjected to, or any deprivation of one sort or another, any cruelty, it feels it just as much as you and I. So that was my personal motivation. But in terms of the wider picture, I'm cognizant of the fact of the environmental impact of meat, and also the health impact of meat in terms of the human population. In terms of the health impact, I came across a quote recently from the World Health Organization country representative in China, in which he said, as long as people eat meat, pandemics will not be a matter of if, it'll be a matter of when. So, and we know we're living in one of those periods now. In 1915, there was a huge pandemic, 1915 to 1918, that sort of time period, which originated in a Kansas farm, poultry farm, and it killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide in the earlier part of the last century. Pandemics have been around and will be around as long as we eat meat, because of all the zoonotic diseases we have today, things like Ebola, MERS, a number of other things. And in fact, I recently discovered even measles originated in cattle about 1,000 years ago. And all of these have transitioned across into the human being. And so now we are plagued with these same zoonotic diseases in reality.
So are you saying, not to cross you, that these diseases comes directly from consuming the animal that whatever animal you mentioned?
Directly and indirectly. I mean, there have even been suggestions that HIV, in certain parts of Africa, people eat chimpanzees. And the chimpanzee population has had HIV in it well, as far as we can establish, going way back in the fossil records for many, many thousands of years. But people eat chimpanzees. And obviously, as you know, HIV could be spread through blood. So obviously, consuming chimpanzee blood is possibly one way, if the person eating it or killing it had a cut or something, for them to get contaminated. But it's also the proximity, living in very close proximity to animals. So obviously, in a cattle rearing or an animal husbandry type situation, we've heard of these wet markets in China. But even living in close proximity to the animal means that you have a higher risk of contracting whatever it is they've got. You've heard as well of things like bird flu and swine flu and such like. These are all zoonotic diseases, but spread quite often through the meat industry or the poultry industry, for that matter.
So my question is, you would probably think growing up, consuming poultry, when you hear of certain diseases, you think maybe it comes from people, I don't eat snake or I don't eat chimpanzee, but something as popular, as poultry. It's like in your everyday diet, and I don't, are people predisposed to this information, or it's just like something you have to go searching to find? Is it like readily available?
Well, unfortunately, people's memories can be very short-lived. We're currently going through a pandemic. Whether in 100 years' time people will actually remember this pandemic is another matter, because as I said, 100 years ago, there was that big flu pandemic that swept the world, killed 50 million people, and most people don't even know about it. The flu that originated, I mentioned earlier, in this Kansas poultry farm. So again, this has nothing to do with countries of origin. In America and so on, they're going on that this is Trump is saying this is a Chinese disease or Chinese virus. But in fact, it happened in 1915 to 18 from an American Kansas poultry farm. But nobody says that's an American flu, American whatever. But it's crucially, these are zoonotic diseases that have stemmed from animals because of people's either close proximity, because they're breeding them in terms of having them to be slaughtered subsequently, or they're eating them. So this is how it's crossing the species boundary.
Can you explain to us the environmental impact meat consumption is having? Can you explain that to us?
Okay, well, globally, something like 18% of greenhouse gases emanate from the meat industry. And this is something that it's not a number I'm picking from thin air. This is the United Nations Climate Change Unit that's focused on climate change issues. That's their figure. And that's a minimum figure, because when one considers things like refrigeration, because meat has to be refrigerated, an aubergine doesn't need to be refrigerated. No. It wouldn't go off. But if you leave meat out for 12 hours, it'll be rotten. So obviously, when you factor in the refrigeration energies that go into there as well, then of course it even pushes up that figure above 18. In fact, I've heard figures like 25% and things like that in terms of the meat industry globally. And that would include fish eating as well, because obviously fish also need to be refrigerated. But when you consider that people talk about carpooling and avoiding traveling by planes, I see now this is a very much a campaign on in many European countries, particularly in Sweden, avoiding plane travel. But plane travel is 2% of global warming gases. In total, fossil fuel transport globally, including planes, including boats, including trains and cars and lorries and everything like that, it's 13%. But the meat industry is 18% at least, if not more. So, clearly giving up meat is the single, in terms of global warming issues, it's the single most important thing you can do. But interestingly enough, Al Gore, he did this film, Al Gore, the former United States presidential candidate, called Inconvenient Truth. And he never mentioned anything about meat in there, because unfortunately, meat is an inconvenient truth to many people, because it goes into people's comfort zones. People are so accustomed to eating meat that they can't envisage a life without meat. And so Al Gore, despite making this excellent film, never once, to my knowledge, unless I'm totally wrong, mentioned anything about meat. And of course, meat as well has other deleterious effects as well, in terms of, example, water consumption. Apparently, a meat eater's annual consumption of water, in terms of, because obviously the animals have to be watered and washed, and their feces and stuff have to be washed away, and even the carcasses are hosed down and so on. So the amount of water used by a meat eater in a whole year, vegan would use a 12th of that. So if I put it another way, a meat eater's monthly consumption of water is equivalent to a vegan's annual consumption of water, if I put it in a roundabout way, you know. It's a 12th of a vegan consumes a 12th on average, obviously an average, of water consumed by meat eaters. And also there were studies done by the University of Chicago saying, for example, a vegan driving a car produces a ton less carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases than a meat eater without a car. Right, so I mean, the evidence is clear when it comes to rainforest destruction and so on. Again, something like 70% of rainforest destruction is attributed to the meat industry in terms of cattle ranching, and also the growing of things like soya to feed the animals, the sheep and the chickens and obviously the cattle as well. And also in terms of land use, something like 5 times more land is required to produce a pound of meat protein compared to a pound of vegan protein. Wow. So there are lots of serious and good arguments.
Deforestation as well.
Yeah.
It's definitely taking place.
As I mentioned, yeah. And then we talk in the Caribbean about this thing about sargassum coming, yeah. But sargassum is, nitrates cause sargassum growth. And there's so many nitrates constantly being washed into the sea from battery farms, particularly poultry farms. And if in America, I've come across a figure like 10 billion chickens are kept in poultry farms annually. So, you know, think of all the nitrates coming out there in their excrement and being washed down into the rivers and then into the seas. So it's not surprising that we've got all this sargassum growth with the amount of nitrates building up in the sea. Wow. For example, you know.
I'm in awe. I'm sitting here thinking, you decide to change your diet for all the right reasons, but it really has an impact on the environment as a whole. What can we do as Caribbean people? What can we do here in the Caribbean?
Well, we can emulate what many Rastas do. A lot of Rastas are vegans. Of course, they're vegans for religious reasons, but in terms of their diet, excellent diet. They eat ground provisions, they eat nuts, they eat obviously things like callaloo and vegetables, fruits. That is the diet we need to eat. And in the Caribbean, in the CARICOM area, the single most cause of fatality is non-communicable diseases. Something like 70% of people in the CARICOM area who die are dying from non-communicable diseases. Things like hypertension, diabetes, cancers, obesity as well. You can factor in terms of cardiovascular issues. And on a vegan diet, you're less likely to be obese because the roughage in the food actually takes out the fat in the gut as you're, and it cleans itself, as it were. So you're less likely to be obese if you're on a plant-based diet. Of course, if you eat rubbish, you eat a lot of sweet things and so on, anybody can be obese. But in terms of the normal average person eating a plant-based diet, it's a rarity to see an obese vegan or vegetarian, for that matter.
Okay, so explain to us in your own words, right? What you think, I don't want to say a perfect world, but a world where, let's say, we don't consume meat for like a year. Or a year's not enough to turn back all the damage that we've done. But you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I was reading some parliamentary debates from England during the early 1800s, when the discussion of abolishing slavery was being introduced or discussed. And people were saying, if we abolish slavery, then the slaves themselves, the enslaved peoples, will die, because obviously they're so reliant on the plantations that, if the boss man isn't giving them food and water and shelter, they're going to die, right? So the people who were opposed to slavery claimed they were sympathetic to the enslaved, and this is why they're opposed to ending slavery, because they said if they end slavery, the slaves would suffer, right? But the same argument, interestingly enough, is advanced towards animals now, because people are saying, well, if you don't eat meat, what will happen to the animals? Who's going to feed the cows? Who's going to feed the sheep? Who's going to feed the chickens?
Overpopulation.
Right? All of that, right? But they forget that cows, sheep, and chickens, as they currently exist, are man-made, or that's a sexist term, but human-made creation. They've been bred into what they were. A cow was a wildebeest at one time, right? A pig was, one of these wild hogs or whatever, right? And chickens were originally from the rainforest or the forests of India. and they were transported all over the world. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
To start with, we would have to neuter a number of them, so they wouldn't be able to reproduce. They're artificial entities that we created in terms of, they're feeling sentient entities, but they're artificial. It's like how the dogs are. A dog comes from a wolf, but your little chihuahua or whatever looks nothing like a wolf, right? I mean, these are artificially bred creations, yeah? So in a world where people didn't eat meat, there'll be less cows, less sheep, less chickens, and those that exist will be returned to nature to the best of our limited abilities, as well as which we would be using less land area, so more areas can be reforested, returned to woodland, which would also act as a carbon sink in terms of greenhouse gases, and also, there'd be more biodiversity, there'd be more variety, and life would be much more interesting. So just from a sort of aesthetic point of view, that would be positive. But also you'd have a healthier population because, as I explained earlier, people eating a plant-based diet will be healthier. Things like obesity and diabetes and hypertension, of course, they will still exist. People are genetically prone to some of these things. But a lot of us are that way because of our lifestyles, and in particular because of our diets. So if we lived in a world that was a vegan world, those things would be reduced considerably. Also, interesting enough, I've been reading that, that originally, I mean, obviously it's a historical fact that they exist now, but even things like weapons. Weapons were developed initially for hunting, and then were used against humans. Of course, now we've gone so far that we can't, de-invent them, but it's interesting to note the origin of weapons, that weapons, people when they were hunting deer or whatever, they developed the bow and arrow, and then when they had a feud with their neighbor, they used the same bow and arrow against the neighbor and put an arrow through the person's neck, right? So, I mean, the linkage between violence and animal cruelty is quite strong, and also has been shown people who work in a butcher-type environment, an abattoir environment, are more prone to be involved in domestic abuse issues, because it follows. I mean, if you're living in a violent world in terms of your workplace, when you go home, you will continue with that violence, and blood and gore is the norm. So a lot of people who are abattoir workers or involved in the butchery profession, if you can call it that, are people who are also quite often involved in domestic violence. So hopefully in this world there'll be less domestic violence, and there'll be more sensitivity and respect for other life forms.
Anyway, guys, thank you so much for stopping by. I am Mishka Maktir. Make sure that you guys follow F.A.M.E Festival _Barbados on Instagram, all right? And see you guys next week at another F.A.M E Weekly Talk. I'm Mishka Maktir.
Okay.
Yay! What?